For decades, the story of how the first people arrived in Canada seemed straightforward. History books, museums, and scientific research all pointed to the same explanation. A single group of ancient hunter-gatherers crossed a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age. From there, they spread throughout North America and eventually became the ancestors of all indigenous peoples across the continent. It was a simple and convincing narrative. But in recent years, a revolution in genetic science has completely transformed that understanding. Ancient DNA recovered from human remains across Canada, Alaska, and other parts of the Americas is revealing a far more complex story than anyone imagined. Instead of one migration, there appear to have been multiple populations. Instead of one ancestral group, there were several. And some of these ancient people carried genetic signatures linked to populations whose descendants now live thousands of miles away on the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean. The discoveries have forced scientists to rethink nearly everything they believed about the first Canadians. For much of the 20th century, researchers supported what became known as the Clovis First Theory. According to this model, the earliest people entered North America from Siberia by crossing Beringia, a vast land bridge that once connected Asia and North America when sea levels were much lower. After spending generations in this region, these people supposedly moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened between massive glaciers. Their descendants spread rapidly across the Americas, eventually forming the many indigenous cultures encountered by Europeans centuries later. The theory was elegant because it offered a single explanation for the settlement of an entire hemisphere. But new evidence began raising serious doubts. One of the earliest challenges came from South America. Archaeologists discovered ancient skeletal remains that looked surprisingly different from those of modern indigenous populations. The most famous example was a young woman who lived more than 11,000 years ago. When scientists analyzed her skull, they noticed features that appeared more similar to indigenous Australians and Melanesian populations than to East Asians. Initially, many researchers dismissed the finding, yet similar discoveries kept appearing, suggesting that ancient America may have been home to populations far more diverse than previously believed. Then genetics entered the picture. In 2015, researchers studying DNA from indigenous groups living in the Amazon made a remarkable discovery. Certain populations carried genetic markers unexpectedly linked to indigenous Australians, Papuans, and people from the Andaman Islands. Scientists called this mysterious ancestry Population Y. Its presence suggested that some of the earliest inhabitants of the Americas carried genetic connections that traditional migration models could not easily explain. The question quickly became obvious. If this ancestry existed in South America, could it also have existed farther north? To answer that, researchers needed ancient DNA from regions closer to Canada's earliest settlements. One important clue came from the remains of a small child discovered in Montana, alongside classic Clovis artifacts. Dating back approximately 12,600 years, the child represented one of the oldest genetically analyzed individuals in North America. His DNA confirmed connections to modern indigenous populations, but it also revealed a more complicated history than researchers expected. The genetic patterns did not fit perfectly into the traditional single migration model. As DNA technology improved, scientists began examining ancient remains from across Western Canada, British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and the Arctic. What emerged was a picture of extraordinary complexity. Rather than finding evidence of one unified population spreading across the continent, researchers discovered multiple genetically distinct groups occupying different regions at different times. Some populations appeared closely related, others seemed surprisingly separate. In several cases, genetic evidence suggested that entire populations had been replaced by newcomers. This was particularly evident along the Pacific coast. Ancient remains from coastal areas indicated that some of the earliest people may not have traveled through the interior of North America at all. Instead, they likely followed the coastline by boat, moving gradually southward along rich marine ecosystems. This coastal migration theory had long existed on the fringes of archaeology. Now genetics was providing powerful support for it. Individuals living along these coastal routes carried ancestry that differed from populations occupying inland regions. The implication was profound. The peopling of the Americas may have involved multiple migration routes operating simultaneously. Meanwhile, the Canadian Arctic revealed another extraordinary chapter. For years, scientists assumed that the ancient Dorset culture and modern Inuit populations shared direct ancestry. Genetic analysis overturned that assumption. The Dorset people, who thrived in the Arctic for centuries, turned out to be genetically distinct from the ancestors of today's Inuit. When the Thule people expanded across the Arctic roughly 1,000 years ago, the Dorset population largely disappeared from the genetic record. Their culture vanished, and their DNA left almost no detectable trace in living populations. Then came another major breakthrough. In Alaska's Yukon region, researchers analyzed the remains of two infants buried approximately 11,500 years ago. One of them belonged to a previously unknown population that scientists named the ancient Beringians. These people represented a branch of humanity that had separated from the ancestors of modern indigenous Americans thousands of years earlier. While their relatives spread throughout the Americas, the ancient Beringians remained in the north. Eventually, they disappeared, surviving only through ancient DNA. Before this discovery, nobody even knew they existed. Another famous case involved Kennewick Man, one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries in North America. His skull looked strikingly different from those of modern indigenous populations, leading some researchers to speculate that he belonged to an entirely separate group. When scientists finally extracted his DNA, the results surprised everyone. Despite his unusual appearance, his genome clearly linked him to modern indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The finding delivered an important lesson. Physical appearance alone can be misleading. Ancient populations were often far more diverse than scientists once believed. As more DNA samples became available, researchers encountered another long-standing mystery known as haplogroup X. Most indigenous maternal lineages in the Americas trace back to genetic groups commonly found in Asia. Haplogroup X seemed different. It appeared among several indigenous nations in North America, but was largely absent from modern East Asian populations. Eventually, ancient DNA from Siberia and Central Asia solved the puzzle. The lineage had once existed in ancient Asian populations, but later disappeared from many regions. The ancestors carrying haplogroup X entered the Americas during the earliest migrations, preserving a genetic signature that later vanished elsewhere. The lesson was becoming increasingly clear. Ancient populations were often much more diverse than their modern descendants. Adding to the mystery are archaeological sites that continue pushing back the timeline of human arrival in the Americas. Some discoveries suggest humans may have reached the continent earlier than once believed. If humans arrived before the traditional timeline allows, then some groups may have traveled primarily by sea rather than by land. This idea aligns with growing evidence that ancient coastal populations possessed impressive maritime skills. Rather than slowly wandering across a land bridge, they may have navigated vast stretches of coastline using boats and sophisticated knowledge of marine environments. Such a scenario would help explain the remarkable genetic diversity found among early populations. Instead of one isolated migration, there may have been multiple waves involving different groups from various parts of Asia. Some carried ancestry more closely connected to East Asians. Others may have inherited genetic traits linked to ancient populations whose descendants survive today in places like Papua New Guinea and Australia. The result was a human mosaic far more complicated than anyone imagined. For indigenous peoples of Canada, these discoveries reveal an ancestry of extraordinary depth and resilience. Their ancestors were not members of a single homogeneous group. They represented multiple lineages, multiple migrations, and countless generations of adaptation to some of Earth's most challenging environments. At the same time, ancient DNA reveals stories of disappearance and replacement. Entire populations once existed that left little or no trace in living communities. The ancient Beringians vanished. The Dorset people disappeared. Other mysterious groups remain visible only through fragments of bone and genetic material. What emerges from all of this is a dramatically different picture of Canada's distant past. The settlement of the land was not a single event. It was a process spanning thousands of years. Different populations arrived at different times using different routes. Some flourished, some merged with others, some disappeared entirely. Every new DNA sample adds another piece to this enormous puzzle. And with each discovery, the old narrative becomes harder to defend. The first Canadians were not one people, they were many peoples. Their origins stretched across vast regions of ancient Asia and connected to some of humanity's oldest and most diverse lineages. Ancient DNA has opened a window into a forgotten world filled with migrations, encounters, adaptations, and mysteries that remained hidden for thousands of years. And as scientists continue uncovering new evidence, one thing becomes increasingly certain. The true story of Canada's first inhabitants is far older, richer, and more astonishing than anyone ever expected.